Hello, thank you for joining us for this webinar where we're going to be talking about New Family Social's brand new piece of research that's been launched this week. The report is called The State of the System, and it looks into the experiences of LGBT plus adopters, foster carers, and how it went for them during assessment, and crucially how they've received support since a child's been placed with them. I'm going to introduce my colleague James, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about how this piece of research was done.
So State of the System was developed primarily so that we could understand a little bit better more how people were finding the assessment process and also what kind of support experiencing further down the line. Because so much of the focus is often placed on people entering or starting to explore adoption or fostering, far less is known about what it's like 2-3 years down the line when you're reliant upon your local authority or agency to provide support. So we opened up a survey for 6 weeks and asked our LGBT plus adopter and foster carer members a range of questions looking at the different experiences and different ways they may have sought support. Primarily, when people responded, they fell into the traditional gay, lesbian identifying in terms of their sexual orientation, and also primarily as male or female, rather than any of the other gender identities that, that people may identify as. However, it is noticeable that there's a small number of people who don't fit either of those two broad categories, so it is absolutely worth adoption and fostering agencies making certain that all of their forms and paperwork give people the option to select the sexual orientation and gender identity that's most appropriate to them. Okay, if we start to take the key findings. So the first key finding is that 1 in 2 LGBT plus adopters sought support in the past year, with 1 in 4 of them doing so in the past 3 months. Now that is probably unsurprising, specifically the 1 in 4 statistic, given that in the past 3 months we've all gone through lockdown in various ways, shape or form, depending on which part of the UK that you sit in.
Our next key finding was that 4 in 10 LGBT plus adoptive parents say that their agency responded to direct requests for support within 5 working days. So we were pleased to hear that for 40% of our respondents, they're having a good, fast response. A further 11% say that their agency responds within 10 working days. So again, a reasonably quick response for those people who are not in immediate crisis, but we were pleased to hear that. Obviously, it leaves a fair number outside those quick response times.
Absolutely. And most concerning of all is that 9% of respondents said that their agency didn't return phone calls and never responded to emails, which obviously is a support gap for those families that are approaching crisis or have a real need for support at a difficult time. The third finding is that of the post-adoption support delivered, 1 in 3 interventions were done through the Adoption Support Fund. However, there was a reluctance identified of agencies to work across UK countries. And this was specific to Wales and England, where access to the fund was causing unnecessary distress and delay to our adopter and foster care, to our adopter members, and their children. And the primary issue seems to be where either the child's agency was reluctant to make an application to what's essentially an English support fund, or for the English agency to work with the Welsh agency to put the funding bid in.
Some further key findings that we had. So 4 in 10 LGBT plus people who are currently in the adoption approval process are reporting delays to their assessment due to the coronavirus pandemic. And we also saw that in family finding to a lesser degree. So 1 in 3 LGBT plus people at that stage were reporting delays due to the pandemic. A similar proportion of LGBT plus foster carers said that their ability to foster was impaired as a result of the impact of the virus. So we can see delays across the board. Now, again, this might not be surprising in the strange times that we've been living through, but it does mean that for those children and those families, currently things are stalling a little bit, and that is a cause for concern.
And I think a similar cause for concern is that there doesn't appear to be a consistency across the agencies across the country in terms of what moves online, what can be done face to face. And it seems very much that there's an absence of national guidance in terms of how the agencies are approaching this. The next finding is that 1 in 7 LGBT plus people, which is 16%, who are currently being assessed for adoption, say that their sexual orientation has been a barrier in the process, and that rises to 1 in currently at the family finding stage. And this is a real cause for concern, because if we want to see the huge numbers of LGBT plus people coming forward to explore adoption and fostering continue, then instances of discrimination need to be tackled, and also where practices are slipping because of coronavirus, and where people might assume that someone is discriminating against them because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but in fact there's another reason, that needs to become far to those people who are going through the process.
I think something on that one, James, for me, it hasn't changed much since we last surveyed our membership, which is a concern. You know, we would think things would be getting better. And I think the fact that 1 in 3 people at the family finding stage were saying that they have experienced LGBT plus being a barrier for them is concerning, because I think for many agencies, their only measure of are we successful with the LGBT communities is have we approved and matched lots of LGBT people. But those people by definition have been approved. They're in the matching process, but they may not really be success stories if they feel that that process has been a disproportionate struggle for them.
Absolutely, and there were absolutely reports anecdotally that was submitted to the survey of same-sex couples being told that a family finder would prefer a mum and a dad, or a husband and a wife in one case, for the child that they were family finding for. And that obviously is deeply distressing to hear if you're a single or a LGBT plus single or in a same-sex relationship and trying to be matched with a child with whom you're going to build your future family.
Our final key finding was that 67% of LGBT plus adopters and foster carers are aware of the extent of adoptions by same-sex couples. What we mean by that is that in England, 1 in 7 adoptions are to same-sex couples, and we were pleased that 2/3 of the respondents were aware of that statistic, that there was really quite a good awareness of the levels of adoption by LGBT plus people.
And the reason that we're particularly pleased with that finding is that we know from historic YouGov polling that there is an expectation of discrimination amongst lesbian, gay and bisexual people when it comes to putting yourself for adoption or fostering. And it was 8 in 10 lesbian, gay and bi people who were polled at the time said they expected that their sexual orientation was going to be a barrier if they were approved to foster. Or if they applied to foster rather. So seeing that so many people can correctly identify how widespread adoptions by same-sex couples are is a good measure of how powerful the statistic is and how it works against the expectation of discrimination. So it would be good to see something similar for the fostering side of these two parenting routes.
So New Family Social has taken this study, and we're only summarising it here, but the full study is available to member agencies of New Family Social. And we've made these recommendations. The first one is adoption and foster care agencies need to update their paperwork and systems to include a wider range of sexual orientations and gender identities. We are still hearing about forms that say female name, male name, things like that, that don't give full range of relationship options, that don't give a range of gender identities for people to tick. And so it's really immediate barrier for people trying to find their way through the systems. It's not hard to update, and really it's the time that it should be done.
Our second recommendation is that agencies need to lead on internal audits that ask the question, how well do we meet the needs of our LGBT plus applicants, parents and carers? And this is such a key and vital thing for agencies to do, because if you purely look at statistics alone, that doesn't prove that you're actually having an impact. So for instance, if you know that you've got 5% of your applicants who are bisexual, you want to be looking at how do you approach that particular sexual orientation, what questions do you ask while you're taking that person through the system and helping them through to being fully approved, and what attitudes are you unpicking while you're going through the assessment process, because too often we hear from our members that a bisexual applicant is asked to pick a side so that they can present as either heterosexual or gay, so that they're more palatable to the panel stage of the assessment process. Actually, that is not the way forward. Making someone more palatable to somebody that doesn't have full understanding is not a solution to this situation.
Our third recommendation is that agency staff must, as a matter of routine, receive regular and refresher training on working with LGBT plus communities and understanding those issues. We have some agencies who regularly take up training either from us or from other providers, but many don't. For some, they simply don't feel that there's much for them to learn. And for others, they aren't particularly motivated to improve their practice in this area. In both cases, that view is wrong. So there are things to learn, whether an agency is already dealing with lots of LGBT plus families or whether they really aren't at the moment. And it's essential that training is built in and routine.
Absolutely. Next recommendation is that training and information dissemination on the structure and availability of the Adoption Support Fund needs to be enhanced. It's fantastic to see the level of access that our members are making to the Adoption Support Fund. However, there does seem to be a real tension between those agencies in England and those outside in terms of what can be applied for, who should lead on the application, and then managing what that looks like. It's not enough to say that the agencies in England are familiar with it. It needs to be agencies from Wales as well, because if they have the responsibility for a newly placed child in England, then the Adoption Support Fund will be a fantastic asset for them to apply to. But if they don't seize that opportunity, then it can be a real hassle for those parents who are struggling with behaviours or need immediate support. And if that avenue is closed off to them, then it becomes really difficult.
Our next recommendation is that there needs to be stronger guidance on how to approach people when they disclose that they are in a consensual non-monogamous relationship, sometimes called an open relationship. At the moment, both in this survey and we're hearing from our members that if they're in a partnership and have agreed that the partnership is open, or indeed if it ever has been, that if this is disclosed, it's proving to be a big stumbling block for people because the professionals involved aren't familiar with how that might work and view it as a concern immediately rather than trying to find out more. So we're at a time where we need that mature conversation about how LGBT plus adults, and indeed many heterosexual or cisgender adults, might choose to structure their relationships and what that means for adoption and fostering, focusing all the time on whether that means that a child will be well parented and well cared for, or whether it's a non-issue in that regard.
Given that we're in 2020, we risk being put in a situation where applicants who are LGBT plus and are in consensual non-monogamous relationships are placed in a don't ask, don't tell situation. And we're in 2020, and that doesn't feel to be the most appropriate, or indeed, as Tor says, sure way to resolve this situation. Our final recommendation is that the fostering sector must monitor and publish its engagement rates with the LGBT plus community. And this is because there is historically very little information about how many LGBT plus people explore and then go on to actively foster. And it's impossible, as things currently stand, for anybody to provide that data, because whilst it sits in monitoring forms across the various agencies, it's not collected and published anywhere. Whereas with adoption, you can look at the Department for Education published statistics in terms of the number of same-sex adopted and build confidence within a community that historically has an expectation of discrimination. We can't do that with fostering because those statistics don't exist. If those statistics started to be published, they would, it's fair to say, probably start off from a low base, but that is where the adoption statistics started from. And as it became more visible, and as there was more faith in the statistics, and they were robust and they were published and people could interrogate them, then the confidence grew and the visibility grew, and the numbers of people who were interested in adoption grew too. And if we are serious about wanting to encourage more LGBT plus people to explore fostering, that needs to occur, because we know from the YouGov polling that 8 in 10 lesbian, gay and bisexual people thought their sexual orientation would be a direct barrier to them being approved to foster. And until there's some leadership and there is some direction and travel from the fostering sector in terms of addressing that, any efforts at attempting to improve recruitment are going to stumble, because there is no way to prove that you are open or accessible to a community that expects you to discriminate against it if you don't monitor and talk about the success stories that are actually taking place.
So they are the recommendations that arise out of this report. And if you're hearing that and thinking, we want to act on those things, we want to be forward thinking, then how can New Family Social help you to do that? Well, first of all, New Family Social has been offering training to agencies for several years now, and it is highly regarded and highly recommended. We will be making that training available online from January 2021, so it can be delivered remotely and it can be delivered in person as well. If your agency hasn't had training, or hasn't had training recently, or has had new staff join who haven't been trained, you need to be trained in how to work with LGBT plus people. It doesn't have to be us, but get training. You can't say that you're appropriately working with this community if you've never had that. The second thing is that for the first full week every March, we run LGBT plus Adoption and Fostering Week, which is an awareness raising campaign for LGBT plus people to ask them to consider adoption and fostering when they consider raising children. And you can be part of that in all manner of ways. It's a hugely successful, hugely impactful campaign. And again, if you aren't part of that, you perhaps aren't linking into a community who form a substantial route for children who need homes and need families. Thirdly, if your agency is not yet a member of New Family Social, join New Family Social. We can support you in accessing this community, serving well this community, supporting this community, and ultimately the thing that we're all interested in, finding the right families for children who need them. So please do join. It's great value for money and we'd love to have you. If you haven't been a member, ask other agencies. We can put you in touch with people who will talk to you about the benefits of joining.
And if you're an LGBT plus individual, become a bronze member of New Family Social for free. And that will let you use our handy agency finder to find those agencies that are committed to welcoming LGBT plus applicants and seeing them through the process. You can also find our information sessions as well, which will give you details of when agencies are holding information sessions in your region. if you are an LGBT plus individual, there are lots of free of charge once you've set off down your adoption and fostering journey. Although obviously if you are keen to take out a personal subscription, we're not going to say no. You can find out more about that on our website.
And finally, another service for agencies is that we can offer support with family finding. So if you are looking for a family for a child or children, then do get in touch, because we hold a list of our members who are at the family finding stage if they want to be kept in touch within that way. So you might be thinking, well, how do I get in touch with New Family Social? Because it sounds fabulous. First of all, you can have access to summary copies of this report if your agency is not yet a member. But if your agency is a member, you can have access to the full report, including the background information that helps us arrive at these recommendations. You can contact us on the web, newfamilysocial.org.uk. On Facebook, search New Family Social, all one word. On Twitter, it's at LGBT Adopt Foster. Our podcast is Adoption, Fostering and Tea, and you can find that on our website or search your podcast provider. And our phone number is 020 3880 2683. I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us and listening to the summary findings from this report. It's you that really can make a difference to make sure that LGBT plus people can access your agency, can access adoption and fostering, and ultimately can help us all to find homes for those children that need them. So thank you so much for listening, and we hope we'll see you again soon. Thank you.